Are you aware that there's a village in Nigeria where women run mad if they cheat on their husbands? Nsukka village is that part of Nigeria, known for their love for custom and traditions. But there was one which they revered so much. This particular one was a powerful custom that strikes women with madness immediately. If they cheat on their husbands, the only solution for them to regain their sanity was when their husbands forgave them and performed a special ritual to the ancestors to cleanse the land. No woman dares to break the rule, not even when they see their husbands on the bed with another woman. But what if someone did it to save a life? Now stay with me as I take you to the journey on how Jane sacrificed her sanity to save her husband's life. But you won't believe what happened after that. James and Jane were very good friends from their school days. After their youth services they decided to get married. But before then James, who was from Nsukka, told Jane about their tradition. There is a custom in my village, James said to Jane one Sunday evening as they sat at the balcony staring at the outside city. If a married woman cheats on her husband, that woman will run mad. Jane laughed out loud and said, "Why on earth would a married woman cheat on her husband? Over my dead body would I do such?" James, knowing fully well who Jane was, nodded his head. He knew that his Jane would never even try anything like that. She hadn't done it even during their courtship, when there was no tradition, so why would she do it now? James and Jane had been married for 5 good years. Their house was filled with love and happiness, joy and laughter. They had a little beautiful girl named Mercy. Mercy was the apple of their eyes and the reason why their lives continued to grow in harmony. People around them knew how much James and Jane loved each other. At times people talked about them. "Can't you see the way James and Jane love each other? They are both inseparable," they would always say, and they were right. James and Jane were inseparable. Their love language was something that many people admired and respected so much. But one day everything changed. On that particular evening, James came home and began to complain about stomachache. Jane, after scolding him for always taking too much alcoholic drink, went over to the garden, cut some bitter leaves and squeezed them. She gave James the juice from the bitter leaves to drink. "I have told you to reduce the way you consume those chemicals," Jane said, urging James to finish the juice. James squeezed his face and emptied the whole juice at one gulp. The next morning, James began to complain again. The pain was no longer mild, he said. It had started as if something with teeth was biting him in his stomach. Jane urged him to see a doctor. At first James refused, saying that he would buy medicine from the pharmacy. But Jane insisted. That wasn't the first day James had complained about the stomach pain, and each time he did, he would always go to the pharmacy to buy some drugs. The worst part of it was that the pharmacy stores wouldn't run a test on you before recommending any drugs for you, while some will give you fake drugs to worsen your sickness. Inside the hospital, Jane and James sat in the doctor's office waiting for their results. It was the results that the doctor gave them that shattered their lives forever. The doctor told them that James had a kidney problem that needed surgery urgently unless something bad would happen. As if that wasn't enough, the amount of the money for the surgery sounded worse than the sickness itself. James was admitted to hospital while Jane went home to search for money. Jane sold all her expensive jewelry, bags, shoes and clothes. She sold their 2 cars and their 3 plots of the land, yet the money wasn't completed. One day Jane decided to meet her friend, Janet. Jane and Janet had always been friends since they were born. Their parents said that they were born on the same day and at the same hospital. That was the reason they named them Jane and Janet. Some people outside their home thought that they were twins, but they were not. They weren't even from the same village. Janet was surprised to see her beautiful friend so emaciated and tattered. She hugged Jane and began to ask her what the problem was. Tears rolled down Jane's eyes as she began to explain the whole thing to Janet. Janet was one person that knew how much James and Jane loved each other. Jane told her how she had sold everything she had, yet the money wasn't completed. Janet, on the other hand, told Jane about a man she knew. The man was a very wealthy man who had been helping so many people in the city. I think we should go and meet him, Janet said finally, and Jane nodded her head in agreement. The next day Janet took Jane to this wealthy man's house. The man was known as Big Fish. Big Fish was inside his luxurious sitting room with a cup of wine. When Janet and Jane came to his house, he ushered them in and asked one of his male servants to serve them drink. Janet drank the wine, but Jane didn't drink. Wine was the least of her problem. 4 days she had not eaten. But how could she have eaten when her better half was laying, half dead and half alive in the hospital bed? After a while, Janet cleared her throat and began to explain everything to the Big Fish. After her explanation, Big Fish promised to help them. He would give them the money, but on one condition. What conditions? Jane asked, suppressing the happiness on her face. Nothing in life comes easy. I will give you money to save your husband if you sleep with me, the Big Fish said, stroking on his beard. What? Never. Hold your money, Jane shouted, and left the sitting room. Jane stood in the middle of the sitting room in Janet's apartment, her heart pounding and boiling like food on top of the hearth. She couldn't believe that Janet would take her to a man like that. How could she? Why would she take her to someone who had no respect for the sanctuary of marriage? Jane was preparing on how to fire her words. Janet came in and slammed the door loudly. The loud sound from the door made the whole apartment vibrate. Why would you walk away like that? Janet snarled. At first Jane was surprised. She was the one who was supposed to be angry and not Janet. Well, two people wouldn't be mad at the same time, Jane reasoned. She asked Janet why she would take her to such a man, and Janet replied that she did everything for her so that she could save her husband. But you know I can't do that, Jane said calmly with tears in her eyes. I am confused, Jane, but you have to do whatever it takes to save your husband's life. Have you forgotten that my husband is from Asuka? Have you forgotten their tradition? Jane said slowly. Janet hesitated for a while before she replied. Jane, I know. I remember their tradition, but this is the only way to save James. I am sorry, but you have to save James. Janet, you know I will lose my sanity if I do this. What will happen to my daughter? Who will take care of Mercy? Jane asked. I am here. I will take care of Mercy until James gets better and performs the ritual. James loves you so much. He will understand. He will forgive you. But despite Janet's words, Jane couldn't see herself doing it. What if James died in the surgery? Who then would perform the sacrifice to cleanse the land? The thought of it was overwhelming for Jane. The next morning, as Jane walked along the hospital corridor, her high-heeled shoes clicking against the hospital floor, she saw the doctor waving his hands over to her. Jane touched her chest, asking the doctor if she should come, and the doctor nodded his head. Jane followed the doctor to his office, and with a worried face the doctor asked, Mrs. Jane, have you got the money? Jane shook her head and said, No, sir. With the most suitable voice the doctor said, You need to get the money fast. Your husband's health is getting worse every minute of the day, and if the surgery didn't happen soon, anything can happen. His last word hit Jane like a blow. Jane slowly left the hospital office and went over to see James, who was laying helplessly unconscious on the hospital bed. She stared at him for a while and tears filled her eyes. She had never imagined that a day like that would come. At home, Jane sat on the bed, her mind filled with many things. She can't let anything happen to James, she told herself. James didn't deserve death. What would she tell her daughter? That she had the opportunity to save her father, but she didn't. She remembered her life with James, the first day she met him. James had always been her rock since the day they met at the campus. He was so loving and kind, and had always helped and supported her in all her decisions. What if she was the one in the situation, she asked herself. She knew that James would do anything to save her life. She knew that James would cross all seas to see her well again. She looked at her daughter, who was on the bed sleeping for a while, and picked up her phone. Janet answered the call immediately, as if she had been waiting for it. Janet, Jane said, I am ready. I am ready to save my husband. I want to meet Big Fish. You made the right decision, Jane, Janet said slowly. Few minutes later Janet drove in, and they left for the Big Fish house. Jane sat on the bed inside the marvelous bedroom. Her hands and body trembled. She couldn't imagine that she was the one doing the thing she was about to do. She closed her eyes and began to talk to her husband. James, I am doing this for you, to save your life. If this is to be the price I have to pay, so be it, but I want you to stay alive. Forgive me, James, because I am about doing the thing you hate most in life, but it is for your own good. When she opened her eyes, she saw the man with a protruding stomach, like a 9 months pregnant woman standing in her front, grinning from ear to ear. Jane shut her eyes again, waiting for the things to be done. That night felt like the longest night in the world. Jane tightened her eyes as Big Fish pressed his body on her. She kept on reminding herself that everything was for her husband. After everything was done, she felt empty, harrow and embarrassed. Big Fish approached her with the sum of the money in a brown envelope. He handed the money over to Jane, and immediately Jane ran out of the compound. She ran straight to the hospital, then went to the payment point and cleared all the bills. Through the window she stared at her husband, shook her head, and tears trickled down her eyes. James, find it in your heart to forgive me. Soon you will be fine, she muttered and left. Janet was with Mercy inside the sitting room when Jane entered so dejectedly. Janet, knowing what happened, calmed Jane down by giving her a glass of water, but Jane couldn't drink it. Janet, Jane called, and Janet lifted her gaze up. You know, anything can happen to me now. I am no longer safe, but I want you to do something for me. Please take care of my family. I will go inside the quest room. Please lock the door and don't open it no matter what. Janet knew the reason Jane had said that. It was said that any madness that entered the market was no longer a small madness, and that was what Jane didn't want for herself. It would be better she remained inside the quest house until James performed the sacrifice. Jane, you have always been my best. We are more twins than sisters. Everything will be fine. You are a strong woman, and I want you to be strong for yourself. Jane kissed Mercy on the forehead and handed her over to Janet. Please, look after her, she said, and left. Jane entered the room and pressed her back against the wall. Cascading tears flowed down freely from her eyes, and she sank on the floor. It was for the good, she told herself. The next day Janet begged her to open the door, but Jane refused. She didn't know when the gods would visit her, so Janet went to the window side, and there they spoke to each other. Jane, what if the gods has decided to have mercy on you, because you did it to save your husband's life? They don't have mercy on anyone, not even if you did it to save your life or that of your child. Jane laughed out loudly. I think that they have decided to. Janet was about to say, but Jane cuts in. See, James, my husband. Janet swept her eyes around and noticed that the gods had come. Jane began to tear her clothes, to scream and to mutter nonsense words. Janet pressed her back on the outside wall and wept. You will be fine, my friend, she said. Meanwhile, James' surgery had been shifted to the next day. Janet carried out all the promises she made to her friend. She took very good mercy and visited the hospital. On the day of the surgery, Janet went to the hospital, pacing rhythmically along the hospital corridor like a pregnant woman in labor. Her heart was beating so fast. If anything happened to James, she would be finished. Who would take care of Mercy? As all these were going through her mind, she saw the doctor emerging from the surgery room. How is James, doctor? Janet asked, staring at the doctor. The doctor smiled sweetly. Congratulations. Everything has been done and James is now out of danger. Janet breathed out slowly, and a smile crept in and spread across her face. The doctor told her to come back the next day to see James. He wasn't in a good position to receive visitors. The next day, Janet prepared Mercy, and they both left for the hospital. Mercy was so happy when she saw her daddy. Daddy, I have missed you, Mercy said, throwing her little arm around her head. James, even in his weak state, smiled and stroked her head. After a few minutes, James asked about Jane. James, Jane went somewhere, Janet said. Where could it be that she didn't come to see me? He questioned. James, you need rest. I will tell you everything when we get home, Janet said to James. James nodded his head and placed it gently on the pillow. Janet came back after all the hospital visits and school runs so exhausted. She placed her head on the bed, trying to catch some sleep. But the sleep disappeared instantly as Jane's loud scream covered every part of the house. James, I love James. James is my lover. What on earth would she do with that mad woman? Janet asked herself. She sprang up and went to the quest room. Jane, come and see James, Janet said, and Jane smiled. Jane gently walked out of the room. Janet opened the car door, and they both went out. Janet was at the back of the car, chatting and playing with invisible people. At times, she would scream and laugh, or muttered some incoherent words occasionally. When they get to a deserted area along the road, Janet said to Jane, "Come out and see James. Come out." Jane came out, and even in her madness, she still remembered James, as Jane was sweeping her gaze around looking for James. Janet sighed and drove the car away. The next few days James was discharged from the hospital. Janet came very early to pick him up. When they got home, Mercy jumped up and clutched on her daddy's body. "Daddy, welcome," Mercy said, and James gave her a peck. Everything inside the sitting was looking perfectly okay. Janet had made the homecoming more memorable by decorating the sitting room with different colors of balloon, different shades of lights flickering through every side of the room. Then a card on the wall that said, "Welcome back, James." James loves all of them, but something was missing. Where was his wife Jane? Where on earth had she gone to? At night, James couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, still in doubt that Jane would do what she did. After so many thoughts, he sprang up and went over to Janet's room. Janet was surprised when she saw him, or perhaps she pretended to be surprised. James sat down beside the bed on a low stool. "Where did you say that my wife went to?" he asked Janet gently. Janet shook her head and tightened her face. "James, I didn't want to tell you this. I want you to recover before I tell you everything. Tell me now, I am fine." "James, when you went to the hospital and the doctors confirmed what your illness was, Jane left you in the hospital and started following other men." Jane can't do that," James said defensively. "I know that's what you think, but she did it. That is why she's roaming in the street right now as a mad woman. She's also pregnant. What more evidence do you need to believe that? Jane left you at the hospital and followed other men." James pounded over the last statement. The evidence was clear. Her madness showed that she slept with another man, and her pregnancy also was another evidence. James shook his head. Why, Jane? I never knew you could do something like this to me." He thought of forgiveness. He knew that he was capable of saving her if he performed the sacrifice. But the betrayal was much. He might forgive her, but it will take time. Janet consoled and calmed him down, unbeknownst to everyone that Jane was already pregnant before the news of her husband's sickness. Jane, now a pregnant woman in dirty rags and wild hair, now roams around the street, picking things from the trash and sleeping under the bridge. People watched her with pity eyes. Meanwhile, Janet had started taking care of James so well. She cooked and served James with different kinds of food. She also treated Mercy so well. But in all these she had a secret mission. She had started wearing skimpy outfits, transparent tops. James noticed all these, but continued like he didn't see anything. One day James was inside his room when Janet ran to his room, screaming that pepper had entered her eyes. She asked James to blow the pepper out of her eyes. With 8 fingers James pressed the up and down part of the eyelids down and up. Then he began to blow it. As he blew it, tears ran down Janet's eyes, and after about a while, Janet placed her head on James' lap exhausted. It was on that day that Janet's seduction won. Over the next few days their love skyrocketed, and James got married to Janet, and they became a family. It was after this marriage that Janet started to abuse Mercy badly. At times, when Mercy mistakenly spilled her juice on the floor, Janet would slap her and say, "You aren't different from your mad woman." Then the little girl would cry, "I want my mum." But all these she did at the back of James. Whenever James was around, Janet would act as if she was the best mum in the world. One day James was on his way to see a friend in another city, when he picked a glimpse of a pregnant woman picking something from the scraps. He looked forward closely, and there she was. It was Jane, his wife. James froze. That was his first time seeing Jane since he returned from the hospital. The car's honking from the back brought him out of his deep thoughts. James revised his car and went back home. At home he laid on the bed with so many things over his head. He thought of forgiveness. It wasn't easy, but he thought that would be the best. He would do it for the sake of the bastard in her womb and for the sake of Mercy. Mercy needs a mother. As the thoughts were going through his mind, Janet walked in with a tray of food. She placed the food on the table and went over to James. She had noticed from his expression that something was bothering him. "James, what's it?" Janet asked calmly. "I saw her today," James answered. Who did you see?" "Jane. I saw Jane today, and I think I should forgive her." "Forgive her? After everything she did to you? You are about to make the worst mistake of your life." "I am not forgiving her so that she will come back to this house. No, I want to do it for Mercy and the bastard in her womb. Mercy needs her mother, and I don't want her to blame me when she grew up." "James, have you forgotten what this woman did to you? She left you when you needed her most. She wanted you to die in that hospital bed. Mercy doesn't need a heartless mother like her. She will ruin her future. I am here to take care of Mercy." After giving it some thought, James concluded that Janet was right. Why should he forgive someone that left him when he needed her most? The sacrifice wouldn't take anything from his body, but he wasn't going to perform it. The sound of the scream came from under the bridge. Many women rushed down there. It was the mad woman who was in labor. Women removed their wrapper, shielding the mad woman. With no wasting time, the little baby emerged. It was a baby boy. Jane clutched the baby so tight against her body. She might be mad, but she knew the joy that came with having a baby. She trained the baby with the things she got from the scraps. Many people tried to take the baby away from her, but she guided and protected the boy with all her life and strength. She called the boy James. Now that little boy of yesterday was 3 years old. Even at this age, Jane still breastfeeds him. She still carried him like a baby at her back. People often laughed at Jane, asking her if she didn't know that her son was no longer a child. The boy, in the other hand, had also started picking scraps for his mother. At times he joined other beggars begging along the road. Meanwhile, for this year, Janet had tried everything possible to have her own child, but she didn't. The problem of not having her own baby was so overwhelming that at times she carried out her frustration on Mercy. 1 year after her marriage, she told James that she wanted to adopt a child. For James, it was too early for adoption, but Janet insisted. All she wanted was to prove to the man of God that she could be a mother without the baby growing in her womb, and that she would do it without doing what he asked her to do. After so much disturbance from her, James agreed. All he wanted was a peaceful home. The child Janet adopted died 2 weeks after the adoption. Janet cried and cried and cried, but she didn't give up. One night, she woke James up and said that she would love to do IVF. She was ready to do whatever that will bring a child to her. "Janet, all these are too early. This is just 2 years of our marriage. Some people stayed more than 10 years without having a child, yet they didn't die. Give yourself time and you will have a child." James preached, but Janet wasn't buying it. She knew why she wanted the child. She knew how urgent the child was to her. It would be evidence to show the fake man of God that she could have a baby. She continued to nag until James agreed to the IVF saga. All these, James did it to have a peaceful home. The journey of the IVF was so smoothly, but 2 weeks after having the baby, Janet woke up one morning to see the baby lifeless on his bed. Janet screamed and James rushed inside. Looking at the baby, one would think the baby was sleeping, but he wasn't. He was gone. Janet cried and cried and cried. She blamed everyone for her misfortune except herself. James did all he could at that period to console her. He knew how hard it was for a mother to lose a child, let alone the one she suffered so much to get. 4 weeks Janet remained inside her room. She refused to talk to anyone. She stopped caring entirely for Mercy. The only thing different between her and Jane was that Jane had entered the inside market. The first day Janet came out from her room, she took her bath, put on makeup and stormed out of the house. The only option remaining was to look for a surrogate mother. All she needed was to tell her friend, and her friend would sort it out for her. As she walked majestically along the right-hand side of the road, an old man in black suits approached her. Janet had never seen the man before, but what the man said terrified her. "You are looking so beautiful, but your heart is dark, as black as a charcoal. No child will last more than a week under your care. Children have rejected you, and the awful smell from your body kills them." Jane's eyes widened in shock. She sniffed her clothes to know if there's any smell emanating from her clothes, but there was none. "You can't perceive the smell. They rejected you from the day you rejected them." "I have never rejected any child," Janet cuts in. "I have always loved children. You rejected them the day you betrayed your friend. She trusted you, and even when you saw her with pregnancy, it didn't touch your heart to say the truth. You allowed her to wander on the street with the pregnancy. You will never have a child of your own until you confess and she forgives you." Jane's body froze. That was the same thing her pastor had said to her. Children are like spirits. They see what we can't see. If you want a child, go and confess, so that your husband will perform the ritual, and your friend will forgive you. But how could she confess? Confessing meant losing everything. It meant losing both Jane and James. It meant that people would find out what she did, and what were the benefits of the confession. If she wouldn't stay with James, she knew that James would choose Jane over her 1,000 times, and that was the reason she did what she did. She was the one that saw James first inside the campus. She was the first in talking terms with James, hoping that one day James would say something special to her. But he didn't. Instead, he went over to her friend Jane and asked Jane to be his girlfriend. Then Jane came to her asking her if she should accept the guy. She had no option than to encourage and support her in the relationship. But that didn't take away her jealousy. She was so envious of Jane. They were born on the same day, but why would Jane always have the best? Why would people love her more? Everything seemed easy when Jane was involved, but when it came to her, the thing would become hard. That was the reason she decided to separate the two of them, to make sure she enjoyed life and everything Jane had been enjoying. You are jealous of your friend who loves you like a friend. Go and confess before the anger of those children will descend on you. You won't be able to save yourself when they come," the man said, and began to walk away with his walking stick. Jane turned to stop him. She needed to ask him something, but the man was nowhere to be found. She swept her gaze across the street. There's no figure on the street. ... Was that a ghost? Who was that? Could that be God? Jane thought inwardly. She spun around and went home dejectedly, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She knew there won't be a marriage after her confessions, but she was ready to confess. If the children could punish her so severely now, what would happen if their anger descended on her? She might run mad as well. She braced up and told herself that it was time. James was inside the room checking something when Janet arrived. "James, I want us to talk about something," Janet said slowly. "What? Say it. I can hear you." "I am looking for something," James said, still searching the drawers. "James, it is a delicate matter that needs your utmost attention. Please sit down, let's talk about it." "Janet, I don't have all this time. I can't find my documents. If Jane was here, it would have been different," James said and sank on the chair. He was surprised at his outburst. He didn't even know when he mentioned Jane's name, but that was that. Jane had always been the one keeping their documents. "That is one of the things I want us to talk about. I think you should forgive Jane." "Forgive who?" "Jane, why now? I thought you had always been the one against me forgiving her." "Yes, James, but please forgive her. I will explain everything to you after the rituals." James sat quietly, lost in thoughts. Women, you people are unpredictable. The following day James bought the items needed: color nuts, palm wine, and head of snuff. He traveled back to Nsuka and performed the sacrifices. Instantly, from where Jane was laying half naked inside the market, she jerked up and began to cover herself, to ask questions. "Where am I? What is it?" People around stared in confusion. They whispered to each other. "I think she has gotten her sanity back," one said. "Yes, I think so," another said. Jane stopped the bike immediately and gave the bike rider the address to her husband's home. As if James was aware that she was coming, he stood astride on the doorway. As Jane was about to get down from the bike, James shouted, "Go back to where you are from, you harlot." His words pierced Jane's heart, and she stopped dead, staring at her husband, the man she had sacrificed her sanity to save. Jane moved closer, trying to talk to James, but before she opened her mouth, they saw Janet wrangling on the floor outside the compound. "Jane, forgive me. I did it because of jealousy. I have always been jealous of you since we were kids. That was why I lied to James. I didn't tell him that you did it to save his life." James stared at Janet with his mouth open and his eyes widened. How could Janet do something like that? "Janet, you are evil. So you made me believe that Jane left me in the hospital and followed other men. You are evil." James screamed, "Please forgive me. Find a place in your heart to forgive me. I have never seen you as a friend. I have always treated and loved you like a sister I never had. But this is how you pay me back." Jane breathed out gently, stared at the rag she was putting on, her legs caked in dirty. She shook her head sideways. "Well, you can have James all to yourself now," Jane said, and turned to leave, but James stopped her. "Please, Jane, I have always loved you. Forgive me. I didn't perform the ritual because of what she told me," James begged. "Was whatever she told you great than our love? You know me, James, more than anyone, but you betrayed my love. I sacrificed my sanity to keep you alive, but what did you do? You left me to die in the street. I gave birth to a child in the street and also lost him to the street. I will be back to take my daughter. I don't want her to see me this way." Jane left the compound. Janet, after a long thought, went inside the room and stabbed herself to death. She couldn't take it. It was too much for her alone. James continued to hope upon hope that one day Jane would change her mind and came back to him, but it never happened. Out of depression and frustration, he made alcoholic beverages his best friend. At times he would get drunk and sprawled out along the road. His life was shattered. One evening, after his usual visit to the beer parlor, James was staggering home, muttering to himself, when a truck lost its brake and hit him. James was confirmed dead the next day. Jane went to the burial not as his wife, but to be with her daughter. Mercy as she buried her father. Till today, people still talk about the sacrifice that Jane made for her husband. Hello, champions. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Thank you for always watching and listening to my stories. I can't be here without your support. Keep watching, keep commenting, keep liking, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Please leave a comment below. Anything. Just say something.